Welcome back to our personal finance course, our financial boot camp, if you will. Last week's homework assignment was to go ahead and track all of our expenses. From there, we were not only supposed to track a week of expenses, but a 3-month average. That way we could identify different trends occurring. We were also supposed to go ahead and have descriptions so we could group these expenses. And finally, we were supposed to go ahead and prioritize our variable expenses. Well, all the work you did is about to be put to good use, because now we're going to identify necessary expenses. What is a necessary expense? A necessary expense is anything that is a fixed expense. And that, of course, is your mortgage or your car payment or student loans. Essentially, it's anything that has a contract associated with it. Why is that so important? Because if a contract was signed, there is always financial ramifications if you don't pay that expense. Car gets taken, wages get garnished in the future. House you get booted out of, wages once again garnished in the future. There are consequences to not paying fixed expense. So we need to make sure we categorize that as a necessary expense, something that gets covered. We also need to recognize necessary variable expenses. And what is a necessary variable expense? Food. Food is a prime example of a necessary variable expense. How? You're not going to pay the same amount every month when you go grocery shopping. It's just not possible. Why? Because you don't eat the same thing. Maybe one week you're getting cheesecake for dessert. Another week you're focusing on only chicken and vegetables. Another week you decide to do a lean cuisine diet. Another week you go ahead and get pasta. You have different tastes. You change up what you eat. And there's always going to be a certain variance in that. And that's why we did the 3-month rolling average. Because we can identify roughly what we're going to spend in groceries every month. Those are necessary expenses. Everything else is a discretionary expense. Now, when it comes to creating budgets, there's really 2 different ways it's done, the traditional model and the new model. Now, the traditional model is supposed to be income, then necessary expenses, then discretionary expenses, and then financial security. But what ends up really happening in that? It usually becomes income, discretionary expenses, necessary expenses, and then financial security. And financial security being savings and 401k. Why does this occur? Pretty simple. People spend to what they make. For some reason, we all have this thing inside of us that wants us to keep up with the Joneses, to go ahead and have the newest iPhone, to have the nicest belt, to have the best watch, to have all these glamorous symbols, because we want to be liked. And a lot of times we feel like possessions is what gets people to like us. We want attention, and those are the things that help us get that attention. So what ends up occurring, let's say our jar is income, right? That's what our income can afford. What ends up happening is you fill it with sand, and then marbles, and then rocks. And of course, your sand is your discretionary expense. And like I said, you end up filling that first. Even though you're supposed to be doing necessary, almost everyone starts to do discretionary expenses first, because those are the things we like. And if it's something we like, then obviously we prioritize it first. In fact, I'm sure some of you even have variable expenses that you have as a higher priority than you have as your fixed expenses right now. So you fill up the sand first, you have marbles after that, and then you're going ahead and working on your financial security, right, which is your rocks, your foundation. But if you take the new approach, you have the income. Now, I'm Christian, so I do tithing. I pay 10% right off the get-go. Then necessary expenses. Then my emergency fund. Now, my emergency fund is everything that would cover necessary expenses, right? Everything that I have to have in order to survive for a month. Now, if I already have a month in line, I want to go ahead and do 3 months and 6 months, just in case it's a detrimental emergency. Then I go ahead and focus on eliminating debt, because eliminating debt will give me more variable income. Then I focus on discretionary expenses. Then I focus on 401k. Now you're saying, well, why would you do that? It's pretty simple. As you can see with this model, what do? I have the rocks in place. I have some marbles underneath, right? Because I'm doing my necessary expenses, the marbles. Then I'm getting the rocks in, which is my emergency fund. Then I'm actually adding gravel, which is the debt relief. Then I'm adding sand, and then my 401k, that's water. So now I'm able to fill this jar up with a lot more things. And all this will actually create more for me to do in the future. This is what will lead not only to financial security, but prosperity. But we have to do this. We have to prioritize in this manner. And it's pretty simple why. It doesn't matter how much money you make. This model will be more successful than this model. And you want to know how I can prove that? Take a look at lottery winners. 70% of all lottery winners, so 7 out of 10 people who win lottery, still have to file for bankruptcy. Now you're saying that's crazy. If I had just $1 million from the lottery, I could do so many things in my life. It'd be unbelievable. But 7 out of 10 have to file for bankruptcy. And this is why. Because when you prioritize expenses before everything else, you end up spending to your income. So what did they end up doing? They started filling everything with sand, all this discretionary expenses. They got the boat. They ended up getting a Rolex watch, the Gucci belt, the Prada shoes. They got everything. They wanted to have everything everybody else wanted. They wanted to be the star. And now they have nothing. Nothing. And those people were millionaires. How crazy is that? But if you use this model, you'll be fine. Why? Because you're eliminating your expenses. You're paying debt. So when you pay your debt, you start to eliminate some of your necessary expenses because you're eliminating your fixed expenses. You're paying off your car. You're paying off your house. So when you use this model, you will always be more financially sound. And then finally, once we've committed to this approach, then we get back to prioritizing our discretionary expenses. Why? Pretty simple. We still need to have sand. We still need to have those discretionary expenses. Why? Because you won't follow through with this if you're not having fun, if you're not enjoying life. So you have to have certain discretionary expenses. Nobody wants to wake up, go to work, go home, go to sleep every day. That's a nightmare. Total nightmare. In fact, a lot of people have had issues with depression and suicide from COVID-19 because that's the lifestyle they've had to do now. And it just is unbelievably horrible to your mental health. So if you have an option, you're not going to do that. You're just going to go ahead and throw everything away and you say, you know what, I'm going full discretionary expenses because you only live once and screw it, I don't care if I live anymore. So what ends up happening, depression, suicide, everything kicks in, your mental health goes down the crack, and you have all these problems. That's why we still need to keep discretionary expenses. It still needs to be in the calculation. And we have to prioritize what is important. We touched on last week the Starbucks that somebody did every week because it allowed for them to unwind with their friends, and it really helped them have a bond and connect with reality and be with people, and it was amazing for their mental health. Well, that, as crazy as it sounds, as crazy as $4.75 a week sounds, that is a important discretionary expense. It should probably be number 1 or number 2 in their expenses, even though it's minimal. In the grand scheme of things, cost-wise, minimal, but truly it's an important discretionary expense. And as you can see, The sand will filter in between the dimes, the rocks, the marbles, the gravel, and then finally the water. That's the 401k. We get to that last because water can kind of seep in through everything else. But we need to build here. So now that you have gone and identified your necessary expenses, you can create this budget model. For this week's homework assignment, let's create your budget. Take your income. You know it now. Minus your tithing if you're Christian. You want to pay the 10% right off the top. Minus your necessary expenses, all your fixed costs. Your necessary expenses of variable costs being food. An emergency fund. So you want to have an emergency fund and you want to get to being able to pay all of your necessary expenses as quick as possible. So maximize that right away. Maybe you dedicate 10%, maybe you dedicate 20%, maybe you dedicate 30% of what's left after your necessary expenses. But you want to make sure you're getting to paying that emergency fund right away. Why? Pretty simple. If an emergency occurs and you're not doing this, what ends up happening? You have to take loans, which means more fixed expenses, which means more debt and more interest payments. And that just puts you further and further and further behind. So we need to create that emergency fund as soon as possible. Then paying off our debt, because once we pay off our debt, we'll have more income because we're eliminating some of our necessary expenses. Then your discretionary expenses and your 401k. So your homework, once again, create this model and choose what you want to do as far as your emergency fund. Do you want to go ahead and have 20% of that remaining income go to that? Do you want to have 15%, 10%? Pick an amount, but realize how long it's going to take for you to be able to have an emergency fund. And like I said, for me, the goal is to have it as soon as possible. I would dedicate probably 20% of that remaining income to it. That's going to get you there quick, possibly 25 if there's enough income coming in. Recognize your debt. And what I mean by debt is anything you're going to have to continually pay on, your mortgage, your car payment, your student loans, and we need to go ahead and start identifying what that debt is. Now that you identify the top 20 variable expenses, I want you to eliminate the necessary variable expenses, the groceries off of that, and go ahead and realize that you have limited amount of expenses available, discretionary variable expenses available. Cut your list down to the top 10. What are the top 10 variable expenses? Because those are your discretionary expenses that really are important to you. And if you have those, if you have your top 10, you're going to be able to stick to this. And this will lead you to financial security. This will lead you to financial prosperity. So do your homework, and I'll see you next week.